Good evening, and a warm welcome to yet another biography event. My name is Kai Bird, and I am the director of the Leon Levy Center for Biography, a wholly unique institution hosted by the Graduate Center of the University of New York, and founded by Shelby White and the Leon Levy Foundation in the year 2007. I want to thank Shelby for her steadfast support to the Biography Center. It is her vision that makes this program possible. Please note that our next event will be on Friday, December 2nd at 7 p.m. when Aidan Levy, a former Leon Levy Fellow, will be discussing his new biography of the jazz musician Sonny Rollins. He will be in conversation with Gary Giddens, the former director of the Leon Levy Center and the biographer of Bing Crosby. This will be a virtual event only on Zoom. 5 days later, on December 7th, I will be interviewing Stacy Schiff, who will join us in person here in this room to discuss her new biography of Samuel Adams. And I've read it and learned a lot. It's a terrific biography. Please mark your calendars and register for this and our other events at the Leon Levy website. And if you have not done so already, please register your email address on our website so that we can be notified. We can notify you of our future events. But tonight I am delighted to introduce Geoffrey Wheatcroft, who will be in conversation with Simon Winchester. They will be discussing Wheatcroft's biography, Churchill's Shadow: The Life and Aftermath of Winston Churchill. Now, I should mention that we, at one point, advertised this event with the Harvard professor joining us, Caroline Elkins, who's written a new book about the British Empire. But Elkins is on her way this day to London because she's a finalist for some major literary prize. So all to the good, but we miss her absence. Geoffrey Wheatcroft is the author of The Randlords, the story of the South African mining magnates and their legacy, which appeared in 1985. In 1989, he published Absent Friends, a collection of biographical sketches, and in 1996, The Controversy of Zion, a study of Zionism and its effects on the Jewish people, which, in a miracle, I think, won an American National Jewish Book Award. And his book, Le Tour, A History of the Tour de France, 1902 to 2003, published in 2003, and 2 years later, he published The Strange Death of Tory England. And this was followed by Yo Blair in the spring of 2007. Last year, he published Churchill's Shadow, which the New York Times called the best single-volume indictment of Churchill yet published. More recently, he has been named the editor of Lapham's Quarterly.
Who has?
Simon Winchester will moderate this conversation. Winchester is the New York Times best-selling author of The Professor and the Madman. His recent titles include The Perfectionists, Atlantic, The Men Who United the States, and Land: How the Hunger for Ownership Shaped the Modern World. In 2006, Winchester was awarded an Order of the British Empire, OBE, for his services to journalism and literature. He lives in Massachusetts and New York City. Please look for all these books online at bookshops.org, a site that will lead you to your local independent bookstore. And for those of you who are actually here in person, please note that the books will be sold in the lobby at the back, where Jeff will be available to sign them. So we are live streaming this, and there will be questions from the virtual audience as well. Jeff and Simon will be in conversation for about 45 minutes, and then we'll take questions from our audience, both virtual and in person. Please click on the chat box if you're at home at the bottom of your screens to type in your questions. and Simon will try to get to as many of them as he can. Thad will be reading them, actually. Again, thanks to the Leon Levy Foundation for funding this and all our other events. And on that note, I now turn the evening over to that great conversationalist, Simon Winchester.
Well, thank you very much indeed. And it is lovely to be here, and it's lovely to be with you, Geoffrey. So, in question, first of all, I hate correcting you, Kai, but although Geoffrey is amply qualified to edit Lapham's Quarterly, it's actually me that is the editor. No. But the terrible thing is that I'm sure Geoffrey...
It's a small difference.
Geoffrey, I'm sure... Well, nothing, I don't know. We'll make him right for it.
So far, none at all.
But at the end of this evening, well, I think you were misinformed. But the difference is that I'm sure you passed O-level history with flying colours. I, so monstrously unqualified to edit this magazine, failed O-level history. A member of the audience asked me to mention this, just to put it on the record. Now, look. I was going to be moderating this evening a discussion between Carolyn Elkins and Geoffrey, and it was going to be slightly odd because Geoffrey's book is by no means an indictment of Churchill, but it's an alternative view of him, and it's in many senses quite critical. Had I been moderating between Geoffrey and Caroline, whose book on the British Empire is a vitriolic, probably deservedly vitriolic attack on the British Empire, Geoffrey might have been in the somewhat difficult position of saying, hold on a minute, and defending Winston Churchill. And that's, to put it all in context, I think it would be probably useful to get you, before we get into the meat of Winston Spencer Churchill, to ask what your opinion now, after all, both you and I were born at essentially the same time when the empire was not at its apogee, but pretty big and strong and respected or well regarded. Nowadays, of course, it's just a scattering of little islands around the world. So what is your view of the empire, of which Churchill, of course, was a hugely important person?
Well, thank you very much indeed, Kai, and thank you, Simon, for introducing this. What is my view of the British Empire? I think we've got into a tangle. Once, 100 years ago, there was an Empire Day every year in England, and there were imperial leagues and imperial conferences, and the word was used as a term of praise, as indeed was colonial. There was a colonial conference for the prime ministers of Canada and Australia and New Zealand. Then the word and concept fell gravely into disrepute, but in a way which has confused our understanding of it historically. It is one thing to say that cruelty and oppression and injustice and exploitation are wrong, but that is simply a platitude. If you say that something called empire or imperialism is an original sin that cannot be forgiven, then you are condemning most of human history. The British Empire was only the last, not actually the last, but it was one of the most remarkable of all empires. We have fallen into the habit, I'm slightly digressing from, but I'll try and answer Simon's question more directly. We've fallen into the habit of using empire and imperialism as shorthand for white European Christian imperialism. And when someone did that, in effect, in The Guardian a few years ago, Linda Colley wrote to the paper. She's an extremely good historian, and as far as one knows, not a latter-day member of the League of Empire Loyalists, which Simon can just remember.
She is a dame, it should be mentioned.
She's a dame of the British Empire, I should say. That is true, as she belongs to the same noble order as yourself. And she pointed out that only 300 years ago, three of the greatest empires on earth were non-European. Two of them, the Ottoman and Mughal empires, were Islamic. And the third, the Chinese Empire, exists to this day, writ new. The British Empire was only the last and greatest, in the sense of its physical extent, of all European empires. And it was an extraordinary episode in history that for 500 years, the maritime powers of Western Europe, Portugal and Spain first of all, and then England, acquired these enormous empires across the globe, from North America to Australia and India. But to condemn imperialism as an idea seems to me completely futile. You can condemn the actual consequences of it, which is another matter. And the other problem is that when we do condemn, or when people condemn imperialism, they forget the extent to which the entire world has been shaped by those 500 years, for better or for worse. As indeed one African historian said, it is a fact that Europe colonized Africa and not the other way around, and one has to accept this. And it is ironical, really, when European imperialism has become such a curse and such an evil concept, to look at India, the second most populous country on earth, I think.
Just about to be the most populous. They're going to pass next year, I think.
Which has been governed since 1947 by, at least in theory, by various English doctrines, and Fabian socialism, parliamentary government, laissez-faire capitalism. And China, even more comically in a way, is the most violently anti-imperial and anti-European power. But it is ruled by people who at least claim to be the disciples of Marx and Engels, two dead white European males, if ever there were. And so this, the penumbra of empire exists to this day. And one further irony, and I did touch on this when I reviewed Caroline Elkins's book in the New York Times, is that Americans condemn empire and imperialism without quite reflecting on the fact that
they're an empire themselves.
Obviously enough,
yes.
The most significant achievement of British imperialism is the United States of America. So that was...
I wish, in a way, I'm really glad to be just having you on stage, but having listened to you just now, I wish I was moderating between you. I think it would develop into a fist fight. It could have been tremendous. Well, look, let's talk about Churchill, because, I mean, he's central to the empire, and his image has somewhat slipped as a result of current thinking about the empire. But tell us a little about the Churchill myth. I mean, I was astonished reading the recommended reading at the end of your book, the number of books about Churchill.
It's quite absurd, actually.
How many biographies are there?
Well, there are hundreds and hundreds, or if not thousands. I mean, he's like Napoleon and Richard Wagner and Jesus, I think, is at the top of the list of people who've had the most books written about them. He said himself, far too much has been and is being written about me. And that was in 1922, 100 years ago. And the amount that has been written about him since is prodigious. And I suppose I should apologize for having added to it. But I added to it because despite this immense literature, I felt that there was something missing, and that there was a reassessment, which is what incidentally, you quoted the very kind words of Peter Baker in the New York Times, calling my book the best indictment of Churchill to have been published. Authors who complain about unfavorable reviews are bad enough. I think for an author to complain about a favorable review would be intolerable. But so my publisher was naturally very pleased by that review, and so was I. But I did think a little wistfully that I never set out to write an indictment of Churchill. I tried to write what somebody has indeed called it, a reassessment, and to try and strike a balance. I mean, the most recent biography of Churchill by Andrew Roberts, who is, I should say, now Lord Roberts of Belgravia, having been ennobled to the House of Lords by Boris Johnson.
Also, who has written his own book about Churchill,
who also wrote a book about Churchill, which is really the worst ever. I can say quite without...
You're safe here, more or less.
In his book, my book was mostly written before his book was published, but I felt that not a response to it, but just an antidote to such adoration of Churchill. And his book is an accomplished version of the adoration. I'm not the person, because he wrote a particularly violent attack on my book, to ask for a detached view of Andrew Roberts in his book. But Max Hastings has described the Roberts biography of Churchill as fluent but unskeptical, which is one way of putting it. I mean, uncritical is the usual word. And it is. There is very little in that book which gives you the flavor which I've tried to convey of the fact that Churchill, you may think, as I do myself, that his becoming Prime Minister in 1940 was providential, but it was also astonishing because he was then 65. He was one of the most remarkable men of his age. Everyone recognized that. He was a brilliant political figure, an enormously prolific writer as well, and much else besides. And yet he was also the most disliked and distrusted politician in England by all sides. The Tories had hated him for years and years, and they went on distrusting him even when he became Prime Minister in 1940 and leader of the Conservative Party. The left hated him, but some of them thought that he was the English Mussolini in waiting to establish a fascist regime, which wasn't true, but I mean, the fact that people said that at the time is significant. And because of 1940 and the aura surrounding the finest hour, it became very difficult to view Churchill himself objectively. We grew up with this, Simon and myself, who grew up after the war, Churchill, although he was Prime Minister when we were young boys, yet again in 1951 to 55, most unsuccessfully, I should say, he had somehow departed from the pages of conventional history into the realm of myth.
Well, I want to ask you about that, about how the myth, it appears to be cracking or tarnishing in England, but not over here. The word, which I'd never heard until I read your book, Churchillophilia,
yes,
seems alive and well in places like Fulton, Missouri,
well,
where
absolutely.
they transported a church over to Fulton, and there's a part of the Berlin Wall. I think Edwina Sands is, who lives here, she might even be here tonight, she lives above the Victoria's Secret at the corner of Broadway and Prince Street, I think in Soho. She's a well-known local artist, the granddaughter, of course.
I was criticized, among other things, for even using the expression the Churchill cult, as though I'd coined the phrase myself. People have been writing about the Churchill cult. Alistair Cook wrote in 1952 that Churchill is now the subject of a veneration in America, which might even embarrass him and his own compatriots. It is 60 years since the very first issue of Private Eye, the English satirical magazine, had a spoof cover with the headline, Churchill cult next for party acts, ? Meaning the Conservative Party, which had by then developed its own cult of Churchill, rather, in the first place, rather reluctantly. And it's now 30 years since Christopher Hitchens wrote an essay on the Churchill cult and the way that it had grown out of all kind of proportion in America. And the Reagan administration was largely staffed by people who were collectors of Churchill's books and attended Churchill societies. There are now Churchill societies from sea to shining sea. Every state has somewhere or other a Churchill society. And although there are several shrines of the Churchill cult in England itself, Blenheim, where he was born, and where Donald Trump wanted to be taken to be shown the room where Churchill was born when he visited England. An interesting visit, by the way, because he had hoped to ride in a procession with the Queen through London in a golden carriage, but it became clear even to his advisors that he was so unpopular in England that he couldn't appear in public. And so he was flown by helicopter to the American ambassador's residence at Regent's Park, and then flown by helicopter to Blenheim, where Theresa May, who was then the Prime Minister, and by the way, it's difficult to keep up with our Prime Ministers, you may have noticed. There have been rather a lot of them recently. She received him with a red carpet, literally a red carpet, and the band of the household brigade playing for him. There is Chartwell, which was his own house, which is well worth visiting. I do recommend it.
Is it National Trust?
It's National Trust, and very, very nicely kept up. A lot of his paintings, another aspect of the Churchill cult is the completely absurd prices being paid for his paintings. $15 million. I mean,
Are you serious? 15 million for a Churchill watercolour?
Yeah, or oil.
Oil.
But I mean, the prices bear no relation to their aesthetic value.
Are there institutes over here of Churchill studies at universities?
I don't think it's gone quite as far as that, but there's Finest Hour, which is the official organ of the International Churchill Society.
Is that what it's called? That is what it's called.
That is what it's called, yeah.
The newspaper. Well, look, I want to get on to the sort of specific charges. The book is not an indictment, and it is an alternate view, and I think that ought to be borne in mind because, I mean, you're a bit like a barrister in that regard. I mean, I see you as sort of Charles Lawton saying, "Are you not a liar?" Sort of that kind of thing. But let's go through the specific things. I mean, first of all, was he a racist?
Yes. I mean, there's no question. That's not even yes, no, or maybe. Yes, he was. He was. The important thing, the other thing I was going to say, I didn't want to make too many ponderous general points, but we are at the moment oppressed by prochronism and the great crime, really, of judging the past in terms of the present. And you can't understand the past unless you at least try to understand it in its own terms. Of course, 80 years ago or whenever, most people's attitudes towards empire and race were different to those we hold today. But it is very important to remember that Churchill was decidedly more of an imperialist and a racist than his contemporaries. I mean, his attitude towards India shocked his contemporaries. I mean, in 1921, Edwin Montagu, who was the Secretary of State for India, when Churchill had been ranting in the cabinet about the Indian settlers in East Africa, in what's now Kenya and Uganda, and Edwin Montagu said that his views were those of the most bigoted white settler. And during the Second War, Churchill has been defended, in my view, a pretty specious way by Andrew Roberts and others over the Bengal famine in 1943, when millions died. But you don't need to judge the Bengal famine as from today. You only have to see what Churchill's contemporaries thought, and both Field Marshal Wavell, who had been sacked by Churchill as Commander-in-Chief in North Africa and sent to be Commander-in-Chief in India, and then the penultimate Viceroy before Lord Mountbatten, and Leo Amery, who was Secretary of State for India in London, what they both thought about Churchill. And Wavell was appalled by the neglect of the Bengal famine, that he was unable to do more than as much as he would have liked.
Because Churchill wouldn't let him.
To relieve him, because Churchill wouldn't let him. And Amery, who was an old imperialist himself, as the imperialist was then understood, said that he thought Churchill's attitude towards the Indians barely distinguished him from Hitler. And that was not somebody writing in the New York Times or the Nation today. Those were Churchill's contemporaries.
I think it's worth pointing out, I've always thought Wavell, I mean, he was militarily a failure, but as a compassionate human being, I think.
Very much so.
And he wrote, of course, one of the great anthologies of poetry called
Other Men's Flowers
from the Montaigne.
It is possible,
quote.
of course, that somebody, a general who edited an anthology of poetry wasn't ever going to be much of a success as a general.
Well, too busy. But he hated Wordsworth, which is a good mark in his favour. So also, I mean, he had contempt for people in India, but he quite liked Muslims. He thought Hindus were ghastly.
He hated Islam as a religion and wrote very scathingly about it. I must say, in 1898, and in terms which, are not completely absurd. He said that wherever the prophet reigns, women are subjugated and the economy is sterile. And if you rephrase that passage today, many people could still write it, or they'd be accused of Islamophobia. But if you look at Iran at the moment, you can scarcely say that it's a beacon of light for women's rights. What he admired in India were the Muslims, because the Indian Muslims were the martial race, right. And they were he thought, the more warlike. With the people
like the Pathans in Afghanistan.
Yes,
and
that was absolutely.
What did he think, I mean, Palestine, what did you think of the Palestinians on one hand and the Jews on the other?
He despised the Palestinian Arabs because he despised all Arabs. He thought that he was, on the whole, philo-Semitic, consistently so, and he'd been brought up by his father, Lord Randolph Churchill, who had many Jewish friends, and they were usually called Rothschild.
Right. It helps.
To admire the Jews, and he met Chaim Weizmann, who became the Zionist leader as early as 1905 in Manchester, where Weizmann was working as a
professor of chemistry at the University of Manchester.
At the University of Manchester. And Churchill was captivated by the idea of Zionism, as many people were who weren't Jewish, he wasn't an evangelical Christian, which some of the Gentile Zionists were. But anyway, by the time that the Balfour Declaration was issued, and then the British acquired what was called mandatory Palestine in 1920-21, Churchill visited Palestine and Jerusalem and thought that he was immensely admired the Zionist settlers and thought quite simply that they were bringing modern civilization to this backward land, because of course he thought that was what the European settlers had done in North America and Australia. What he said, though he's a hero to many neoconservatives here, but if they examined what he is cited as a supporter of Zionism in Israel, but if you look at the terms in which he expressed his support, it becomes more awkward. I mean, he said in 1921 that what I've just said, that they were European settlers who were bringing European civilization to this benighted land. And in 1937, when the Peel Commission was investigating what was then the bloodshed in Palestine, there was the 1936 to 39 Arab revolt, which was put down with extreme violence by us, the British, not least including the RAF and Arthur Harris, who went on to greater things, bombing Palestinian
Dresden,
Arab villages to shut them up. And Churchill gave evidence to the Peel Commission. And when he was asked whether he didn't think that the Palestinian Arabs were getting a raw deal, that wasn't quite the phrase, he said, no, not in any way at all. It was simply the advance of history when an inferior race was supplanted by a stronger, or in his own phrase, higher grade race. That was what was happening in Palestine. He thought the Jews were a higher grade race than the Palestinian Arabs, and the fact, therefore, that the Jews were taking the country over was a very good thing. Well, not even Mr. Netanyahu wants to quote that, even though he keeps a portrait of Churchill in his room. That actual Churchill was straight to the point. You know, he saw things in those terms.
Let's I don't want to get bogged down too much in Palestine.
No.
Fascinating
Well,
it is. But let's talk about his. One of the criticisms you level is that he was a strategic bungler, that he prosecuted wars badly.
Well,
the classic example is Gallipoli, so why not talk a bit about
Well, indeed. I mean, I think that Churchill, it is a fact that Churchill was responsible for one military cock-up or disaster after another. I mean, he saw a great deal of war when he was a young man, perhaps rather too much, but they were colonial wars when he was subjugating Afghan villages on the northwest frontier, and described the subjugation in extremely blunt terms. You know, we burn their crops, we fill their wells, we destroy their villages. Then he was at the Battle of Omdurman in Sudan in 1898, when 10,000 not unarmed, I mean not using rifles, tribesmen were killed for the loss of about 58 British soldiers. And then the Boer War. And he never got to terms with modern war at all. I mean, in 1914, he was one of the first to see that the Western Front was going to become a complete stalemate, which was, there he was completely correct. But his answer was to go on with one campaign after another in that war and the next war, which always had the same thing in common. They were British expeditionary forces to far-flung places, and they always ended in disaster. Gallipoli in 1915 was a completely absurd campaign. To realize how absurd it is, or was, you only have to go there, which I've done, and Churchill never did. I mean, to land an army on this tip of this peninsula, a long way from what was then Constantinople, and to try and fight its way along. And even the belief that if Constantinople had been taken and Turkey had been knocked out of the Great War because they were an ally of Germany, is now hard to comprehend. And then in the next war, there was one fiasco after another, in Dakar in 1940, in Crete in 1941, and Dieppe in 1942. And Churchill, it seems rather sweeping to say he didn't understand modern war. There is something, of course, admirable or possibly attractive about the way that he wanted to minimize casualties. He was like all his generation, who particularly when they'd lived through the Great War, in which nearly 1 million British soldiers were killed, along with 1.25 million Frenchmen and 2 million Germans. There was something perhaps admirable about the way he wanted to avoid such mass slaughter in the next war when he was Prime Minister. But the trouble was that, he said in 1941 in a radio broadcast directed particularly to America, that was the war which ended with the words, the broadcast that ended with the words, "Give us the tools and we will finish the job," which appeared to mean if the Americans, who were then neutral, provided enough munitions, the British could defeat Germany, which Churchill knew better than anyone was completely absurd. But anyway, he also said in that broadcast, this is not a war of vast armies firing huge quantities of shells at each other. That was exactly what it was.
Yes.
And certainly was about to become in June 1941.
My father was in the North African desert fighting, and often wondered in later life why, and I wonder if this is a strategic criticism of Churchill, why so much time and effort was spent in the Mediterranean when
Well,
the real
indeed.
focus of the war should have been in Europe.
Well,
was that not part of colonial? We wanted to protect
Well, it
Suez
was part
and
of,
so
that
forth.
was part of it, and certainly the people who agreed with that were the Americans,
Right.
who thought once they entered the war after Pearl Harbor, and throughout 1942, when it was not decided what form the Allied strategy should take against Germany and against Japan, and was for the Americans, for Roosevelt, there was always a problem, which was that the war, for most American people, the war of 1941 to 45, at the time, meant most of the time the war against Japan. And the war against Japan, as Dwight MacDonald observed at the time, was always far more popular with the American people than the war against Germany. You wouldn't know that today with what you might call the Spielbergization of history, sort of combining Saving Private Ryan with Schindler's List. You could easily form the impression that the Second World War was fought against the Nazi tyranny by American democracy to save the European Jews. That is not the case at all.
Funny, my father was, I don't necessarily divert this too much, but he was captured after D-Day in Normandy, and ultimately liberated by American forces from a camp in eastern Germany, and was so humiliated at being liberated by Americans, big cigar-smoking guys, and he was sort of emaciated, that he, for many years, he would never come here. He just was
Really?
embarrassed by it.
Well,
but look, okay, what's the point you're going to make? Because I want to bring this back now to family. One of the things, forgetting great strategic concepts, he was also not a very good father, was he?
He was a disastrously bad father.
Tell us about the children. There were 5, weren't they?
Well, there were 4
Initially,
surviving.
one died, yes, certainly.
They had...
Randolph was the...
Evelyn Moore said in 1965, at the time of Churchill's funeral, that he'd never really admired Churchill. Always in the wrong, always surrounded by crooks, and a most unsuccessful father. And I won't say that Churchill was always in the wrong, but he was quite often in the wrong. Surrounded by crooks is quite a damning phrase, because Churchill did have a gang of associates like Beaverbrook and Brendan Bracken and Linda, who were always terrible people. And he was a really sadly unsuccessful father. He had 3 daughters and a son, and a daughter who died in infancy. And the only one who grew up, as it were, in one piece was Mary. Mary Churchill, Mary Soames as she became, whom I knew and who was a ferocious defender of her father's reputation. I'm almost relieved that she wasn't still with us to see my book, because she gave me enough of a ticking off, even 30 years ago, if I criticized him in any way. The other 3 were all Randolph, and
Sarah
and Diana were all led miserable lives. They were all alcoholics. They all had a series of unhappy marriages and affairs. And I mean, it's a little hard to blame parents for their children going wrong, speaking as a parent. But Churchill was not a successful father, it is true. And you can't, there was something wrong with that family. That they all went awry in that way.
Tell me about his literary success. We forget that he won the Nobel Prize for literature.
He did indeed.
As of course, so did Bob Dylan. So it's
well, that's true, and so did Pearl Buck. And some of the Nobel Prize winners, when you look through the list, are quite remarkable.
But the point I want you to talk about is the extent to which he wrote his own books.
Well, first of all, yes, I will come to that. But he was a very good natural writer. And I would always recommend people to read My Early Life, which he published in 1930, which was just what it says. It was a memoir of his younger days. He wrote he didn't write, he dictated books. And from about 1905, when he became a government minister and discovered the joys of a stenographer, he dictated everything. newspaper articles, speeches, books. But that book, My Early Life, is all his own words, and it has the tang of Churchill on every page, and is a really highly enjoyable book. But from 1930, he'd produced a 2-volume biography of his father, Lord Randolph Churchill, and an enormous series of books about the Great War called The World Crisis, which is largely a compilation of documents and a defense of his own conduct over Gallipoli. But then from 1930 onward, to make any assessment of Churchill as a writer, you have to try to establish, which of course nobody did at the time when he got the Nobel Prize, how much that appeared under the name of Winston S. Churchill, whether books or journalism, was actually written by him. Because in the 1930s, he was earning an enormous amount of money. He was earning 11,000 a year, roughly, which was like
Fortune. Yeah.
Fortune, absolute fortune at the time. And he had a team of ghostwriters working for him. And sometimes he didn't even read the things that were published under his name before they were published.
Did the Nobel Prize come for a specific book? I mean, was it for the history of the English-speaking peoples?
Partly the Second World War, I think, was
Right.
supposedly the reason they gave it to him. Although that as well was largely, not exactly, he was ghostwritten, yes. He had a syndicate working by the time he started. He was paid an enormous advance, $1.5 million in 1946, which was a vast sum. And he had a team of collaborators who just prepared drafts of every chapter. Some of it was Churchill's own words because so much of it was documents which he had, frankly, stolen. I mean, he departed when he lost the 1945 election to Labour, to his astonishment. He left Downing Street accompanied by a convoy of army trucks carrying these documents, which were the property of the Crown or the British people. I mean, and the story is completely scandalous because in the end they were reacquired by the British government by paying his grandson Randolph Churchill several million for papers that weren't his to sell, but still.
I'm interested to know how the affection, the adulation, whatever you might call it, in Britain for the man has been reflected in modern times on policy making. What I'm thinking of is seeing a picture of the odious Nigel Farage in front of a portrait of Churchill, and you think, is that the attitude of, defiance and bulldog Britishness and so forth in some way responsible for Brexit?
Well, unquestionably. I mean, I don't think that the people who voted for Brexit were all brooding about 1940 and Churchill. I mean, the Brexit vote was really a popular resentment of the establishment, or whatever you might call it. But it is true that Farage and, of course, Boris Johnson continually invoked Churchill. And the number of people who've been photographed with the portrait of Churchill behind them is large and rather a comical collection they are. I don't know if you noticed that I thought that until now the most absurd invocation of Churchill ever was by William Buckley in 1965 at the Cambridge Union in England, debating with James Baldwin. And Buckley said that if the Negro is going to be forced into our homes and schools and churches, we will fight as you were recently asked to do on the beaches, on the landing grounds, and in the fields. But what should Ron DeSantis say 10 days ago in his election speech in Florida? But we will fight the woke in the churches. We will fight the woke in the schools. We will never surrender. And I mean, there's a Churchillian phrase to be reused on every possible occasion.
How's the book, how is it done in Britain? I imagine over here it's a considerable success. It was published now quite a few months ago, wasn't it?
It was published a year ago.
Right.
It has not done particularly well in England. It has done very much better here, which surprised as well as pleased me. I mean, I was delighted by the American reception. But I was also interested in the sense that it's possible that the American cult of Churchill is just beginning to ebb a little. I mean, not everyone, Ron DeSantis may want to invoke Churchill, but not every American admires Ron DeSantis. And so, you know, and when Governor Mike Huckabee of Arkansas, former governor, I should say, went to see the movie called Darkest Hour and tweeted afterwards that Obama was Neville Chamberlain. In Donald Trump, we have a new Churchill.
Oh, please.
Yeah.
I think, and I know we're going to shortly move over to questions from the audience, both online, but on the day of the funeral, which was 1965, what month was
January
it?
65.
Because I live nearby, I went to Blaydon Churchyard, where he's buried, and there was no one there. It was quite extraordinary. It was about midnight. There wasn't even policemen. The whole panoply of what had happened during that day with the cranes in the docks bowing, and nation saying goodbye to their beloved leader. And yet there he is in an Oxfordshire churchyard. And you too went there and found.
When I visited Blaydon last, it was deserted. I mean, not deserted is the wrong word. Just a country church with where there was nobody there. But his grave is the one thing that is unvisited, as opposed to the other shrines. By the way, very briefly, because you mentioned it, I mean, there are all the Churchill shrines in England, like the Churchill War Rooms in London and Blenheim and Chartwell. But Fulton, Missouri is now the most extraordinary of them all, and it's well worth a visit because they've got a huge statue of Churchill. They've got a church, a Wren church, which was taken from the City of London and rebuilt quite beautifully, I must say, at Westminster College, Fulton, in the middle of Missouri, which, I mean, the middle of nowhere might seem slightly rude, but it is quite a long way from most places. And they got the Churchill Museum there, and a chunk of the Berlin Wall.
With 2 holes cut in it.
To remind us that of what he said.
Why did they invite him to Fulton, of all places, do you think?
Because President McClure of Westminster College, Fulton, Missouri, which was not the best-known college in America at the time, or even since, had the bright idea of inviting Churchill, who was by then had been defeated in the election in 1945, to come and give an annual lecture at Fulton, at Westminster College, which Churchill would have completely ignored had the letter from McClure not at the bottom had a line saying, "This is a very fine college in my home state. Do please see if you can come, Harry S. Truman." And so Truman had succeeded Roosevelt in April 1945. So Churchill took the hint and
hence the speech. I mean, the speech is the most famous thing about Fulton.
Well, it is the most famous thing. It's a very interesting speech if you deconstruct it, as we now say. It's another subject for another day, but when Churchill said famously that an iron curtain had fallen across Europe, if that was the case, then no one bore more responsibility for the fact than Churchill himself. Because just to go back briefly, he hesitated, as your father was aware of, and my parents and their generation, that the only way for the Western Allies to engage seriously with Germany was in Northern Europe. And the Mediterranean campaign, North Africa, the Italian campaign, and the bombing of Germany were all, in a way, displacement activities to postpone as long as possible what Churchill dreaded, which was a huge Allied invasion of Europe with what he thought might be terrible casualties. But what that meant in turn was that for 3 years, almost all the fighting against Germany was done by the Red Army. When people say, even to this day, well, at least the Second War didn't have terrible battles like Verdun and Passchendaele, indeed it did, but they were called Stalingrad and Kursk.
Yes.
And the Russian casualties completely dwarfed Western casualties in that war. I don't think that's an excuse for Putin, but it's something that I sometimes bear in mind when we...
I want to ask you briefly, and I don't know where Thad is, but when are we going to open this up to? One more question, and then we'll open it. Well, I'm interested in his relationship to and regard, or otherwise for, Roosevelt. What,
well,
did they like each other? Did
well, I've been violently denounced for what I wrote about that. I said that I don't think that Churchill, despite the way that Churchill spun the story of this great friendship between the two of them, it's quite a comical story because they met in 1918 in London when Roosevelt was Undersecretary for the Navy visiting the troops in the Marines in France, and came to a banquet in London on the way, and Churchill was Secretary for Munitions in the government. And Roosevelt was introduced to Churchill and greatly disliked him because he thought that Churchill was haughty and offhand and ignored him. And Churchill completely forgot this. And when they met again in August 1941 at Placentia Bay, it was Roosevelt who remembered the earlier encounter and Churchill didn't. It's become a sort of talisman of a certain kind of Anglo-American friendship and the so-called special relationship, that they were intimate comrades. And there's a particularly ghastly statue of very many ghastly statues of Churchill in Bond Street in London, which is a bench with FDR and Churchill sitting on it, smiling at each other. I don't think it's true. I mean, Churchill, certainly by the end of the war, or before Roosevelt died, was said by colleagues to have just developed a real dislike for Roosevelt, because Roosevelt was so offhand and ignored Churchill's pleas in various ways. And as for Roosevelt, his secretary, Missy LeHand, said that he is really incapable of personal friendship, which I think was true of him. He was a mysterious man, but he was, though he was adored by tens of millions of Americans, he didn't have any really close friends, personal friends. And so this idea of a deep, intimate bond between them, I think, is a myth.
Have you ever thought of doing a similar biography of Roosevelt? It would seem you're the man to do it.
It's an interesting subject, and somebody should do it, but not I.
Right. Well, finally, before we throw it open to everybody else, do you feel a lingering affection, admiration, or...
Oh, yes.
You do?
Oh, yes. Part of me likes him, and rather admires even his deplorable behavior towards editors and publishers. He was, most people would consider his conduct towards his publishers and his editors dishonorable, but he made his own rules. And a bit of me admires his sheer nerve in the way that he went through life making his own rules. And there was obviously an engaging side to his personality, which did engage people in 1940. The British people did warm to his, not just because of the great rhetoric of "we shall fight on the beaches," but because of Churchill wearing his comical whatever it was called.
Sort of jumpsuit, the corduroy thing. Or...
Yeah, which was like a baby's rompers.
Right.
And he became a sort of a figure like beyond history, like Mr. Punch or Robin Hood or something.
I remember he just refused to die at the end.
And then, of course, he refused to die, and he also refused.
Went on and on and on.
He refused to give up the leadership of the Conservative Party, which all his colleagues wanted him to do. But yes, of course, I feel a certain admiration and affection for him. But I don't think that should stop one from taking a reasonably detached view of him after this interval.
Let us see after this interval whether the general public has some questions. Does anyone in the audience wish to quiz Geoffrey about what he's written? So there's a hand there.
I'm wondering if you could talk about this alcoholism.
Yes.
Just by way of background, I'm Amelia Earhart's biographer, and I'm finishing a book that's coming out next year. And there's a first-person account that I uncovered in 1928 when she arrives as a passenger, and it's just over the top on how much alcohol. He's sitting next to Amelia Earhart, and I'm just curious how much of this is this person having fun, and how much is it true?
Well, it's true. I mean, he was, all his life, he drank. He said once that there had never been a time when he could not afford a bottle of champagne for himself and a bottle for his friend. Duff Cooper, who was a politician and who became one of Churchill's associates, saw him, spent what was obviously quite a long evening in 1921 with him, and said that Winston doesn't get drunk, but he does drink a great deal, takes on a lot, and he did drink by most people's standards a good deal. By the 1930s, people were beginning to notice the effects of it, and it's not true that he never showed the effects of his drinking, because I may say that, speaking of a person of age myself, as you grow older, it's harder to hold drink or metabolize alcohol, and Churchill did show the effects of it. People who met him remarked on the fact that he was rather the worse for drink. And Neville Chamberlain made several sly references in his totally fascinating letters he wrote to his sisters, saying that Winston makes many speeches fortified by cocktails and old brandy, and that he would go off to the smoking room in the House of Commons and have 2 or 3 large glasses of whiskey before making his speech. And if you, the subject, if it's contentious, and the Churchillians say that it's somehow deeply offensive even to mention it, but I don't think it is necessarily a slur on Churchill, merely to point out the facts about him. I mean, if you gave any doctor today a list of what Churchill consumed daily, and during the war, not least, the doctor would say, well, this is a functional alcoholic. You know, he handled it very well in 1940, but by the end of the war, there are endless reports by people like Lord Allenbrook, who was the chief of staff, saying Winston was in one of his drunken, tetchy moods, not least because Churchill insisted on working all evening and all night and keeping his generals and his other colleagues up until...
Do you think the famous one-liner, was it Lady Astor? Winston, you were drunk. No, Lady Astor, you were very ugly.
Yes, that's right.
And
yeah.
You were drunk, yes, but the difference is in the morning I shall be sober. Do you think it's true?
That's pinned up. I don't think it is, but it is pinned up in the crypt of the St. Mary's Church in Fulton, where
Really?
there's a collection of Churchilliana, these little jokes he supposedly
Including the
made.
one about Attlee, a modest man with much to be modest
Well,
about.
he may have said that, it's true. But his phrases about there's a ridiculous episode in The Crown in early on when Churchill returns to the prime ministership in 1951.
Played by John Lithgow, right?
Yes, and goes to see the King, George VI, who, as the Crown portrays them, the King says, I'm so pleased to see you again, Winston. Your predecessor was rather a dull fellow, Mr. Attlee. And Churchill says, yeah, an empty taxi drew up in Westminster and Mr. Attlee got out, and they both chortle. Well, Churchill, that was a joke, in quotation marks, that was current at the time. It appears in Angus Wilson's first collection of short stories, said by one of his rather dismal characters. But Churchill would never have said that to the king, or indeed anyone else. And if people made sneering remarks about Churchill, about Attlee to Churchill, he would always put them in their place and say, Mr. Attlee is a great patriotic man, infantry officer, and supported me during the war.
Let's see if there's anybody else in the audience.
Yes.
There's a hand here. Sir. Richard, sorry.
Not that long ago, the Daily Telegraph in London conducted a poll amongst school children about which figures in history were real and which false. And Robin Hood and King Arthur was said by the school children to be real, but Churchill was said not to have possibly existed.
That's
but
right.
my question to you is, probably the best known statue of Churchill is the one opposite the House of Commons.
Yes.
Would you have it taken down? Would you leave it as it is, or would you have some special caption added to it?
Well, I would leave it, absolutely leave it where it is. I'm not at all in favor of tearing down statues everywhere. There is a passage in 1984 which has become more relevant again, that the time when every statue was removed and every name was changed. And we seem to be living through that period. It is one thing to come to terms with history, which we should try to do, stating the obvious. And it's another thing to try and obliterate history. And I'm slightly sad that the statue of Theodore Roosevelt outside the National History Museum on Central Park West has been removed, although it was rather striking with a kneeling Indian, as we used to say, and a smiling black man on one side and the other. But this idea of destroying all monuments is absurd. I mean, you will end up with nothing left of the past at all. The statue of Churchill was daubed with the slogan, to read Churchill is a racist. Well, as I've said, that is factually true. But I don't think we have to be reminded of it by a placard on his statue. No, the statue should stay there, but we should be taught about history, that's all.
Anybody else? Yes, in the middle there.
Yes, I was surprised to hear you describe Churchill as unambiguously philo-Semitic, because didn't he also make some fairly anti-Semitic comments about Jews and Bolshevism and that kind of thing, and see them as conspirators? And was it possible that his support for Zionism was as a way of basically like a lot of Christian right-wingers today, repatriating Jews to Israel and removing them from Europe?
That's a very interesting point, because, of course, a lot of people at that time, going back 100 years, the most passionate opponents of Zionism were the Jewish opponents, like a man I've mentioned already, Edwin Montagu, who in 1917, at the time of the Balfour Declaration, was the only Jewish member of the British cabinet. And he was deeply hostile to the Declaration and to Zionism, because he was, like many assimilated Jews, he thought that it was an insult to him to be told that he didn't belong in his own country. And Churchill wrote this one bizarre essay in 1920, which is what I think you have in mind, about the national and the international Jew. And the international Jew were the subversives, from the people he said were responsible for the French Revolution. It was full of anti-Semitic cliches, and of course the Bolsheviks. And because he was completely obsessed by the Bolshevik Revolution and his horror of it, which took forms of lurid phraseology. And the fact that some of the Bolsheviks were Jewish obsessed him, and he thought that it was, and he did say some very, it's a very disturbing piece to read, but I mean, it's on the whole, but then again, that doesn't necessarily contradict his support for Zionism, because Edwin Montagu would have said, well, that's the problem, you know, you don't really believe that the Jews are part of our country. You want to send them off to Palestine, don't you?
Yeah, so I think that considerably complicates calling him a Philo-Semite, if
Yeah.
you use the
Yeah,
term.
I agree.
Thank you, sir. Anybody else? And what about, there we are, over here, sir.
Thank you for your talk. You mentioned his relationship with Chaim Weizmann, and you mentioned he was a chemist. Wasn't it more than that? Didn't he have a very special relationship as far as British industry and creation of acetone, and possibly because of that, the British felt very indebted to him, and the creation of the Balfour Declaration for the mandate of Palestine. Could you talk about that, please?
Well, that is quite true. Thank you. That's very interesting. It is quite true that Weizmann earned the golden opinions of the British government during the Great War because of his work not as a Zionist, but as an industrial, was a research chemist, and reversing the old phrase about pulling chestnuts out of the fire. Weizmann discovered the way to extract acetone from chestnuts, and acetone was an essential ingredient in high explosive. And so, and chestnuts are a very prolific crop in Europe. If you've ever been to Corsica, where we regularly go, because we have a little apartment there, and the lovely chestnut forest in the northwest of Corsica, I mean the northeast, produces this huge crop which they bake bread from and brew beer from. And so Weizmann became, as you say, popular with the London government for helping them produce the almost insane quantity of shells that they fired
But
off
that
on
was
the
for the
Western Front.
creation of acetone for explosives and the cordite industry, which allowed the British munitions to be, allowed British munition manufacturers to produce cordite, which is an explosive, which helped the British in their war efforts.
Yeah.
Well, mainly in the North Atlantic to deal with the submarines. And the way that the chestnuts were gathered was by British school children who used them to play conkers,
Yes, that's right.
which I'm sure you did in your youth. And that particular year, the conkers, the chestnuts, were collected by the mothers of these children and put in sacks and taken down to London to an old gin factory, a gin distillery, which the British government had taken over because the company had gone bankrupt.
That's true, but it was
They
really
used
the
that.
acetone which allowed
Yeah.
British munitions to create explosives, which is crucial.
Well, specifically gun cotton for the Royal Navy.
Yes.
That's what it was for. Well, this is terrific. Anybody else? My dear, yes. Go over there, yes.
I'm probably going to be accused of talking about my usual subject, but I'm Japanese American, and I feel like in America, one of the biggest developments in weaponry was the nuclear bomb. And I feel like we never talk about it. You know, World War II is talked about frequently, but we avoid that topic. And I'm just wondering, what was Churchill's opinion about that? And what was his involvement? And what was his agreement with FDR?
Well, as briefly as possible, the story is extremely interesting, absolutely fascinating, because the British were the pioneers in nuclear technology. The atom was first split
University of Manchester.
in Cambridge.
Oh, Cambridge, was it? I thought it was
At
Manchester.
the Cavendish laboratories before the war. And Rutherford, who was in charge of this, used to say to visitors at the time that splitting the atom had been a simply fascinating technical exercise, but it had no practical implications whatever. As it turned out, it did. And then, during the war, a group of scientists who were largely Jewish refugees living in England took the development of nuclear physics and nuclear fission further, and that was quite a funny story because they were still technically enemy aliens. They were forbidden to own bicycles and had to report to the police. And they were kept away, these refugee Zionists, from what the government considered the most strategically important questions, particularly the development of radar. And in 1940, nuclear fission was regarded as still a purely experimental and theoretical question. So they did develop the subject. But then, what the British lacked was the industrial resources to develop an atomic bomb. And I've forgotten to get the figures, but the Roosevelt administration spent an immense quantity of money on the Manhattan Project.
Yes, well, the first check was $500, but then it became $5 million,
Yeah.
and then, huge amounts of money.
I mean, it was a very large part of the American gross domestic product from 1943 to 1945. And Churchill, because he'd in effect handed over the rights of developing the atomic bomb to the Americans, and in another sense as well, in a very lamentable way, I think, he gave Roosevelt a blank check to do as he would with it, because the Americans had got the bomb and we didn't have it. And he then, when Hiroshima and Nagasaki were bombed, he was pleased that the war was over. But he then had a conscience about it. And the one creditable reason for his wanting to return to office as Prime Minister in 1951, when his powers were failing, I should say, and he was 80 by the time he resigned as Prime Minister, the one good, honourable reason was that he was appalled by the prospect of nuclear war and hoped that he would rekindle his wartime friendship with Stalin, and that together they would form a plan for peace and ensure that there would never be a nuclear war between Russia and the West. Of course, it had happened already, as we know. The one country that had ever been bombed with atomic bombs was Japan. But when I say he was, I won't say he had a bad conscience about Hiroshima, but he'd supported the area bombing of Germany from 1942 onwards by Arthur Harris and Bomber Command, in which 400,000 German civilians were killed. And by the end of the war, Churchill had become uneasy about that, which is why he most discreditably, in my view, tried to dissociate himself from the bombing of Dresden in February 1945. And because he was a mixture of brutality and chivalry, part of him said, we will use any means possible to win the war. But part of him recoiled from this vast carnage which had been produced by not just by warfare, but then by bombing and including nuclear bombing. And that I think that's the best answer I can give to that. But he was dismayed by the prospect of nuclear war by the 1950s.
Anybody else? Yes, please, sir. That should be the last question. I think all right, I'm terribly sorry. Well, I tell you what, why don't you, sir, hold fire for a moment? Would you perhaps ask your question?
After. Okay.
It'd be second last question.
Okay, thank you.
Make it quick.
Oh, I'm the second to last. Okay. Could you comment on Churchill's relationship with Eisenhower when Eisenhower was Supreme Allied Commander, and whether or not Churchill was trying to, how far Churchill went to influence war strategy, and also their relationship in Churchill's second time as Prime Minister, the overlap with Eisenhower to a degree. And finally, to follow up on the alcoholism question, could you speak about Churchill's depressions and how much they debilitated him or influenced him or his performance and that sort of thing?
Well, I don't know. I'll answer the second part of it very briefly. I mean, who knows how far his undoubted mood swings and depressive tendencies were influenced by his drinking, but to some extent, I'm sure so. His relationship with Eisenhower was interesting because he was writing or supervising the writing of the final volume of his war book, the volume called Triumph and Tragedy, just at the time, in 1952, when Eisenhower was nominated as a Republican candidate and then went on to win the election. And Churchill had to rewrite some of the book quickly because all his criticisms of Eisenhower were muted before publication. And he then tried to embrace Eisenhower as a friend and ally once again. But he had, in fact, been... Sorry, I'm not...
No, you're not going on. I mean, this is terrific, but I think, fairness to you, sir, this will be the last question.
One defense often offered of Churchill's opposition to the invasion of Western Europe was that the delay made it more possible to win, that if the American military had invaded 2 years earlier, they didn't know how to fight, and it would have been a disaster. I'm wondering what your view is of that.
Well, it is quite true that when the Americans entered the war in 1941, they immediately, American generals, started advocating an invasion of Northern Europe, which in 1942 would have been simply a massacre, and almost entirely a massacre of British soldiers, because there were no American soldiers in Europe by that point. And the British, not surprisingly, the British generals resented this, being lectured by the Americans who had so far not fired a single shot. It has been argued, maybe plausibly, that an invasion of Northern Europe could have been possible in 1943. But Churchill just went on dragging his feet. And even in 1944, he wasn't convinced that the time was ripe for the invasion of Normandy. And when he said in 1946 at Fulton, an iron curtain has fallen across Europe from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste, as I've said earlier, he was really not in a position to complain because he had let the Russians do all the fighting. And the fact that all of Eastern Europe was occupied by Stalin's forces was really very much Churchill's doing. Indeed, if he'd prolonged the invasion of Western Europe any longer, the Iron Curtain might have fallen on a line from Hamburg to Genoa rather than...
Anyway, this has been super. It's been wonderful. Thank you, all of you, for engaging with such spirit and interest to what I think, Geoffrey, has been a fascinating talk. We're going to, as MacArthur said, I think, on the USS Missouri, these proceedings must come to an end now. But we do want to thank everyone here at CUNY, but also I've got to say some words which I sincerely meant, thanks to the Leon Levy Center for Study of Biography and to Shelby White for her generosity in underwriting this. So to all of you, and particularly to you, Geoffrey.
Well, thank you very much, Simon.
Thank you very much indeed.